Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Don't let my dampened demeanor fool you. I'm very excited about today's episode. It's just I'm recording this. It's almost midnight on the day before this drops. Naomi is asleep in just down the hall. Don't want to wake her. In this household, sleep is a precious commodity. We have animals that wake us up at all hours of the night to play or because they have a flea on them or something, and so it is just, if one of us is sleeping, let's not rouse them because they'll be up in a couple hours anyway at 3 a.m. scrolling on Instagram. And let me tell you, social media is a great place to be at the moment, is it not? I know I usually say something cynical about the world here in the intro, just for a minute. A quick hit of darkness, just purge my brain of the despair, purge it onto recorded media. I'll be honest though, I don't know what to say anymore. It's just wall-to-wall nausea. I'll tell you what though, immediately in my life, the threat, it's not fascism, immediately. I mean, that's there. That's off in the distance, you're just squinting, and you're like, uh-oh. But right now, when I'm dealing with spiders, because, I don't know if you know this, in Los Angeles, last couple years, seems like there's been a rash of black widows and brown widows and noble false widows, all the widows you could possibly handle. When I'm walking Mabel at night, they're just out in force, and you gotta really be on guard so that, because Mabel she's not good on the leash. She'll barrel right into 10 widows if I didn't control her. But the widows, they stay outside mostly, at least where I am. They're happy being outside. But inside, coming in the house right now, we got these long-legged sack spiders. Or at least that's what my flora and fauna identifying app tells me they are. I think these babies are poisonous. So now what? I gotta be worried about fascism. I gotta be worried about bird flu. Still gotta be worried about COVID. Now these 8-legged freaks possibly poisoning Mabel and Squee. It's too much. But you know what is the balm for everything that ails me? Why, it's today's episode, folks. Today's guest, Fred Thomas. This was a dream. This truly was. Not only am I a fan of Fred's music, but instantly felt some kind of rapport with him. We had a lovely talk. If you don't know who Fred is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Ypsilanti, Michigan, musician Fred Thomas started playing music as a teenager, and in 1994 founded the math rock band Chore. The band broke up 2 years later, and he joined the brilliant His Name Is Alive, and in 1999 started the well-known indie rock band Saturday Looks Good to Me. They would release 8 albums, mostly on polyvinyl, before Fred retired the band in 2013. As a solo artist, Fred has been recording albums since 2002, and his 14th album, Window in the Rhythm, was just released on polyvinyl, and it's fantastic. It's just great. I first heard Fred when his album, a couple albums back, Aftering. I don't know how it came across my consciousness, but I loved it, and I've been following him ever since. And not just aesthetically do I connect with Fred, but it seems like existentially we're on the same page. We're living in the same part of the despair spectrum. So it was just great talking with him. It's always good to find people who you're on the same wavelength with, whether it's on a podcast or whether it is in real life. Uh-oh, I hear Squee meowing outside the door, so I better end this very quickly. Coming up on the show, Brian Ennals and Infinity Knives. Incredible, one of my favorite new hip-hop duos. Jason Aaron, incredible comics writer. Been a huge fan of his for a long time, and that was a great talk, so stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Fred.
It's bleak. I mean, used to love LA. I used to love going there. Not to make this a whole interview about LA, but like I started going to LA on tour, and first I was like, oh, I hate this place. It's so demony and it's so like weird and everyone sucks. But then like after about 15 years of coming, I was like, oh, but this is great. It's comfortable. The food is so good. Everyone's actually nice. I actually like it. And for a window about 10 years ago, 2014, 2015, I was like, Echo Park, I love it. I'm coming here. And then I came back a few years later. I was like, everyone lives in the park now in tents. This is different. Like even a couple of years later, it went from like sort of like hipster, mellow. I could see myself like thriving here to like, oh, people are having a real hard time. People like, I would have a real hard time. I would be living in a tent here if I had like a couple bad days. You know what I'm saying? So that's the vibe I catch from LA now.
Yeah. Well, it is. I don't even know where to start with Los Angeles, because it is. I mean, part of it is corporate landlords, right? And they're the commodification, which is not new, of real estate as a way to make profit. The thing I think that gets me is just you would think that a wealthy person would see the blight and be like, hey, that's bad for profits. And by blight, I just mean like letting it deteriorate, letting people live on the street instead of just giving them like a fucking tiny home or something.
Anything. Even like, anything. We have empty houses that people can't afford. We'll let them stay empty until someone can afford to get in there. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the case in LA. There's certainly like in Toronto, when I go through Toronto, a friend of mine's like, oh, there's like less than 1% vacancy rate in Toronto. I'm not sure what it's like in Los Angeles, but I'm sure there are like homes owned by multimillionaires who are like, well, we just are going to like sit on this for a while. I mean, it's kind of over my head too. When I start thinking about wealth over six figures, I kind of just don't have the background to understand it.
Yeah, no. There is a certain level of wealth where I think you become completely disconnected from both reality and the emotional tethers to humanity.
Oh yeah.
Such that the idea, I mean, obviously, like we're living in this kind of like morally degraded world. I don't know if you were. I don't know. I mean, it's nauseating, kind of like the world we're in at the moment. But like, I was not prepared for this kind of world. I was raised in a pretty moral household. And so when things started to get really bad, I'm just like, wait, weren't we all raised in the same way? Shouldn't we all value life and, truth and other kinds of things? And instead everyone's like, no, it's okay. I don't mind swimming through entrails to get to work.
Yeah. To get to work, to get to like the brass ring. I was raised in a similar moral household, but also in a time when the educators and the elders were like, things are going to get pretty bad about 200 years from now. You don't have anything to worry about. You'll be fine. Because like late 80s, early 90s, when I was going to school, it was like, yeah, climate change. There's this thing called global warming. But, your children's children might have to think about aerosol cans. And, 15 years later, I was like, God damn, there's no more spring. There's no more fall. Everything is terrible.
Yeah. It was interesting how like I have updated my, I guess, red line for the end, capital T, capital E, the end, every like 15 years or so. Cause I remember like maybe, I don't know, in the mid aughts where I'm just like, well, I guess this is heading in a bad direction, but probably it'll be after my lifetime. And I don't really plan on having kids, so I guess, I don't want it to. I've friends and family with children. I don't want everything to fall apart. But I'm like, personally, I'm like, all right, well, I don't have to live through it. So, and then every time there's something major in the world, I just update that. I'm just like, well, it'll be the 2060s, so I'll be old. So I guess it'll be okay then. And then it's just like, oh, I guess it'll be the 2040s. I still have a decent amount of life after that. What?
Like maybe there'll be medication to make it as painless as possible by then. I don't know. Like maybe we'll have like, yeah. It's hard not to fall into like a deeply pessimistic mindset. and sort of feel the helplessness, overwhelm. And I don't really have any answers to that don't sound naive or overly reaching for positivity. I had a moment, we were on tour with, I played drums in a band called Tyvek. For a few years, and we were in Copenhagen, and we ended up at this really just like unpleasant bar after the gig, and there were people that were our hosts, and they're like, there's a part of Copenhagen where you go through and you're like, they cut you with a knife if you like look at them, and like everyone like does all just like the bleakest sort of like they're kind of flexing, these locals were flexing about how rough one of their neighborhoods was. And I was on tour and just so like wilted and tired, and I just kind of, my reflex response was like, I'm sure it'll get better. And he was like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. Why would you even say that? You're not even from here. I was like, I don't know, because I don't care, because I'm tired. Like, because I'm hearing you just like spew this like negative bullshit in a smoky bar after I played to 20 people in a different country. I just want to go to sleep. I don't have any energy left. And it's hard for me not to feel like that when you talk about like the inevitable doom is sort of like, well, my heart wants to be like, there's an answer. Something's going to get better. There's a new generation of really smart, intuitive kids who are going to like figure it out. And even that seems a little bit like Ned Flanders coded or just something I can't really get behind.
Yeah, I've been Ned pilled.
Yeah.
Wait, first question. Were they saying that there's this rough neighborhood as a badge of honor? Like, hey, in Copenhagen, we got this really tough neighborhood, and hey, Fred, you'd never make it out alive in there. Or was it like, man, it sucks. This used to be like, I could go there to the record store, and now I can't because I'm worried some tough is going to pull out a switchblade.
Oh, 85% the first one. 85% like, oh, I can't remember the name of the neighborhood because I grew up not far from Detroit in a time when Detroit was really scary and bad things happened there. And it doesn't actually feel like something I would ever want to like talk about as like in the badge of honor, like, oh, I can handle this tough stuff. It's like, I can't. I lived in Detroit proper for like a year, and I left because I was scared. I left because like there was like a meth lab that blew up across from my house, and I was like, check please, I gotta go. Like, I'm not made for this. So to have someone be like, oh, this neighborhood in Copenhagen, like, yeah, it's like I watched like them like kick a kid and kill a dog, like just like shitty stuff, like just like okay, fine, life is shitty. Enjoy your J Reatard records. I don't know what to tell you.
I mean, I don't bring any of this stuff up just to dwell in it, but I do bring it up, especially with people who are around my age, to discuss how I was not existentially created for the world. For the paradigm shift that happened, for the world that became, for the beast that finally made it to Bethlehem, and it's just like time to set up shop, whatever. Like however we want to talk about like what has happened in the 21st century, and my own existential and creative beliefs about the world are part of this old dead. Not, I don't want to say dead. What is that phrase? Like is it like Gramsci or someone who's just like, the old world is dead, but the new world has not been birthed yet.
Yeah.
And so like you and I grew up in this kind of like old world's dead, Enlightenment's over, but whatever is happening is not, it's not fully formed yet. So we were in like a placenta? I don't know how I don't know how the metaphor is going to work, but you and I were raised in this placenta, and then suddenly things shifted, and I'm just like, I don't know necessarily how to live. And a lot of my energy, and this is another thing that you brought up that I think is interesting, is that I'm tired because a lot of my energy is now going to figure out how to live in this new world.
Physically. Like not even like conceptually, not even theoretically, but I have days where I'm like, okay, after the pandemic began, less people were driving on the highways, so only the people that really like driving very, very crazily and dangerously, those are the ones who are on the highways around me going 100 miles an hour, and there was less police presence, so like they didn't get any tickets. So now like everyone in the Metro Detroit area on the highway is trying to kill you they're actually like, they would love it if they caused a fatal car accident where they died too. And that's just like going to work. So I have a hard time like actually getting in my car and not having a full blown panic attack, because that's like the new reality for whatever reason. So yeah, like I haven't even gotten to the mental parts yet. My music is sort of like an internal place where I can sort of grapple with the mental challenges and the spiritual challenges and the things that I'm still kind of chewing on from when I was a teenager that still don't feel much better, because getting to the record store, I take my life in my own hands and I have to be in a different sort of survival mode than when I'm like sitting here, making beats on Ableton.
I think, I mean, for me, this whole new world, like my dividing line is the Supreme Court stopping the 2000 recount and giving it to Bush, because I mean, it's been well documented since then. If the recount would have kept going, Gore would have been the president. I don't think he would have been a great president, but like he would have certainly been better than Bush. And since then, you saying like the drivers going like 100 miles an hour makes me think a lot about how bad the drivers are here in Los Angeles and how much worse they've gotten since the start of the pandemic.
For sure.
But that dividing line where like the Supreme Court just stops the recount, to me, up through let's just say, I mean, today, right, has been this whole period where the rules have been loosened so that the consequences of people's actions, there hasn't been a lot of accountability either for elites, and that's kind of trickled down to us. So someone driving, in Los Angeles, people just like park and then they just open their driver's side door into the lane and you have to swerve around them. And it happens so often that I just think people are just like, they don't care about the rules. They don't care about their own lives anymore. I think like probably they're maybe not even thinking about it. I don't know. But I'm just like,
the normalization factor becomes something that people adapt to really quickly because it's probably a lot easier to go with it than be tired and outraged and freaking out all the time. It's probably like a can't beat them, join them, or don't even attempt to beat or join them. Just keep swimming upstream kind of mentality. I can't really completely get my head around it. And again, when we talk about it like this, it is sort of a thing where it's like, all is hopeless. Where is the cyanide? I just wanted to get out of here. But I don't actually feel that way in the day to day. I do feel like I feel differently and better than I did in some ways. In like, I think back to like pre-pandemic times, like 2019, and I was like, there was something that was like deeply sad in my life then that I don't have access to anymore, and I can only wonder what would have happened if there had been no pandemic, if there had been no Trump presidency. There was still something, maybe there wasn't enough for me to push against. Maybe there wasn't such an acute feeling of just enemy in the world. Like maybe there wasn't something, maybe it was sort of a thing where I had found a way to be like, oh yeah, I guess I'll just do this forever and like keep on doing the things I've been doing since I was very young. And maybe it's not thoroughly satisfying, but like whatever, what do I have to complain about? And then when things got really dire and really strange and really terrifying, viscerally terrifying, not just like, oh, things are terrifying and like somewhere in the distance there's a terrifying thing, but more like, whoa, like, like I knew people who died from COVID. I knew people who lost parents from COVID. I was nowhere near like oh, this is a psyop or this is overblown. Like it felt so real and so bad, and still feels real and still feels bad. And there are new real bad things. And that maybe just illuminated how much more work there is to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Two things. One, do you think this is what happened to you? That it felt like the last 8 years have been kind of like a clarifying fire. I don't know if that metaphor works. I'll just apologize for my metaphors today. But like it really brought things into focus about what was important. I'm not trying to minimize the absolute horror of everything that's happened in the last 8 years, from COVID to Gaza to Trump to whatever, right? But to say that if there is some kind of silver lining to that horror, it is that it's put everything into focus about like what is meaningful.
That's the hope. That's maybe what I boiled down from that time. That was slow to be clear to me before. When the Trump presidency started, my partner and I were living in Montreal because they were doing grad school there. And it was really psychedelic to have all of our friends who were Canadian citizens be like, weird. Good luck, U.S. And us be like, oh, no. Like, this might be like the end of Roe v. Wade, or this might be the end of like, women's rights, basically. Or this might be like all black people go to jail for like looking at weed. It could be any number of things that some of which have come true and some of which are probably on the way to coming true if it goes the way that, certain factions want it to go. I felt that so brutally, but also I was like, all I do, I can't work because I don't speak Quebecois. We're here on a scholarship paying $500 a month for rent. So all I do is like wake up and go get a coffee and walk around this beautiful, idyllic, romantic city with my existential terror all day. What the fuck is this life? It's so crazy. Yeah. So I was living in that zone pre-pandemic and kind of just like, well, I guess this purgatory is really comfortable in some ways. And I was also drinking then. I don't drink anymore, and not in a way that's like, I am now sober and my life has changed, although it has, but more like, I wasn't on the edge of any great loss or any great destruction, but I was in the midst of like a very, very, very slow unwellness that could have just gone on forever, and then it's now no longer a part of my life. And that feels like a clarifying fire for me personally, and something I wasn't expecting, and something I wasn't really even like making steps towards. I just, I spent so much time touring that you kind of get in the habit of like, well, I'm a vegetarian and I don't like to party, so I guess I'll just like eat the crappy black bean burger at the venue and have 4 to 7 beers, and that'll be my life. So getting out of that habit was sort of like, there's so much more to do. That was a factor for me, like just how dire things have gotten. It feels like, okay, I have energy, I have breath in my lungs, I have things I need to say that may or may not amount to anything, but they still need to be said for me to feel like I'm actually a part of myself.
Yeah. Was there some kind of, I don't want to say incident, because you said you have, you didn't say like this specifically, but like it seems like you have a high bottom, as they say.
Oh, yeah.
Was there some kind of thought, like what precipitated you deciding sobriety?
It was really strange, man. It's happened to me a few times in my life, and this is going to sound probably super cringe to some of the people listening, but I actually remember it so well. It was sometime deep in the early part of the pandemic, like, I want to say like July of 2020. And I was never like a person who's like, whoa, I can't remember last night. I've never had like a blackout from drinking. I've never had like that element of problems. But I did remember like one of the last records I did, the Pitchfork review came out and the reviewer was like, all these songs are about drinking. This is like Fred's like Alcoholics Anonymous record, and he kind of like went through like the Alcoholics Anonymous like 12 steps, and I was like, whoa, that's a really wild angle, because I didn't think about it that way, but that's what this reviewer took away, and I sort of see what he's talking about. I see that there's like a reference to being drunk or a certain type of mindset of fogged brilliance of that like drunken state, or just like, I was drinking a lot on this tour, or like, remember last time I saw you, we were like drinking wine till our eyes were red, stuff like dumb shit like that. And I was like, wow, I really like, I'm leaning hard into that. That feels kind of weird to me. I don't relate to that personally. That must be like a defense mechanism that I'm putting forth in my songs to feel like I'm somebody else or something. But then when I stopped drinking, it was, again, sorry to go back and forth, but like July 2020, and I was alone at my house, and all of a sudden I heard sort of like a voice, just like a very calm voice. It's like, you will never drink again. And that was it. And that was like, I've had that moment, man. I've had that moment a few other times where it was like, when I got married, like there was like a voice was like, "You're going to marry Emily." And I remember I was always alone. I was always kind of like at the end of something kind of like a little bit like draining. I was coming back from a really rough like South by Southwest experience, and Emily had been on part of it and doing like a performance stuff, and we both had like a lot of shows where we felt kind of demoralized or like a nuisance to the audience. And it's one of those tours where it's like, okay, yeah, like sure did go on tour. really glad I drove around the United States and like saw all the gas stations in the world for the last like 4 weeks. But Emily had flown home from like Mississippi, and I had like a couple more. Actually, I had some shows with like bands I really looked up to who turned out to be like, one of the bands were like, oh, they treated me like so shitty. Like I was so excited to tour with them. I'm so excited to play some shows. And the second that I like introduced myself, I was like, oh fuck, these guys are assholes. Or like some of them, like at least like one like pronounced like, oh man, like I was so stoked about this band. I wish I could say the names. Oh, I wish I could say, but it's beneath me to name the names. But one of those tours where I was like, oh yeah, like I shouldn't even be doing this. No one wants me here. This sucks. And so it wasn't like a thing where I was like thinking about my life and what it meant. But like when I was driving home and I was just about back to Michigan, like there's this moment of stillness, and it was like, you and Emily are going to get married in the next year. And that's what happened. And this voice has happened another few times. Like really, it's always something like something so profound stated so innocuously that it feels like it's being beamed in from, I don't really believe in like higher power, like no pun intended on the 12-step thing, but I was kind of like, oh yeah, like there's probably something beyond my understanding that's making things happen, but I'm not going to understand it, so I'm not putting much stock in it. But this is something that I couldn't explain, and it just sort of like, I decided to believe it.
What do you think the voice is? Do you think it's just, some like, how your brain, maybe this is not your brain. My brain is always buzzing. There's like 10,000 things going on. I have to make like 100 lists to kind of like organize and make, keep things in order, or else it's just like the buzzing all the time. Like 10 thoughts. Like there's something I want to go back to and I have to write it down because I'm going to get lost in our conversation. I'll never get back to the thing.
No, I get tangential in my thoughts too. Yeah. I'm like that as well.
Oh yeah, it's 100 tangents. So if your actual thoughts are like the circle, then my brain is like all the lines glancing off every angle of the circle. So do you think it was just like in these moments of fatigue that the real, like the things that you've been ruminating on in the back of your brain finally got to shine through? Or I don't have an or. That just seems like, I'm like, oh, that's interesting to me. That seems like that might be what happened. But
yeah, I think that's highly possible. I don't feel super invested in like mystifying these experiences for myself. They could be, yeah, I was tired and like this was a thought that like I didn't realize I was having. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like it could be a thought that like, how it could feel like I've had like intrusive thoughts in the past and forced thoughts that are usually negative or kind of alarming. And these were the opposite. These were really calm, declarative, but plainly spoken thoughts that might have just been my actual wants speaking to me. And that's cool too. Like I don't need to understand it. The more I go on, the less excited I am about having to understand things, and the more excited I am about like observing the things and kind of like following the unexplainable things to wherever they go, because it's always great.
So you're someone who is okay, or increasingly okay, with the mystery of life.
I mean, if not mystery, yes, mystery, but also if not, I want to say yes, but I'm also like an extremely boring person who like eats 5 different things and like, like I'm looking at like all my records in the room. I'm like, I have like listened to the same like 5 songs for the last like month. I don't like, why do I have 4,000 records? Mystery, but also like just inexplicable things. Like there is injustice, there is like pain, there are things that make no sense. And going back to our original thing, like I just kind of have to have faith that there will be sense made of it for someone, if not me. And if there's no sense made of it, like that's got to be part of a bigger thing that I don't get to understand just yet. And that's totally okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I'm desperate for meaning. Like,
yeah, right.
Like
Me too.
Desperate, like horny for meaning. And I need things to make sense, because otherwise it feels like I am just careening around a kind of Lovecraftian universe of just eldritch horrors constantly like jumping out at me. And without that, without there being some kind of like, it doesn't have to be a unifying principle. And I don't think there is a unifying principle. I studied nonlinear dynamics in grad school. And so I have I think a base small competency in trying to understand like the way that very complex systems like our society or our world work. And it's not like there's like a rule or two rules that bind everything. But without that, my brain explodes. And I'm kind of curious, going back to your childhood, were you okay with the mystery even then?
The beginning, as it were.
As it were. It's almost as if I was leading us to the topic of the show.
The beginnings. My childhood was intense in how little I understood things and how fearful I was of that misunderstanding, and how many problems it created for me as a child that still inform my daily life. To unpack that a little bit, I was born in 1976 to a loving mother and father that are still together. My dad had come home from Vietnam, 2 tours in Vietnam, maybe like, I want to say like 71 or 72. My mom was a teacher. My dad was sort of like trying to find his way post-war experience, post being in Vietnam. And he talked about that a lot when we were growing up, because now Vietnam is like more than 50 years old, and like, you know, it didn't end 50 years ago, but like the Vietnam culture when I was growing up was sort of like, oh, this is like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There was kind of like it's gross to call it, it's profane to call it nostalgia, but there was a profane nostalgia about the Vietnam experience because nobody actually knew what happened except for the veterans.
Yeah.
So there were movies about it and TV shows and comic books and shit like that. That was happening when I was like 12.
Yeah, that was all in the 80s. It was all Vietnam stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Like, there was like a cool, like sort of like, maybe not so cool to the people who had to like reconcile their realities with it, but there was sort of like waves of Vietnam interest, and it's kind of gross when I talk about it now. Many years later, it's like this was like where like the youth of the 60s went to be burned alive and kill strangers, like and be told that this was their like duty. And my dad had to deal with a lot of that, and I didn't realize till, you know, somewhat recently, like how much of an impact that sort of element of my childhood had on things. He was never cruel with me. He was never physically violent. He was not a militaristic person, but he did carry a lot of intense feelings and presuppositions from his time in Vietnam. And that affected me in the way that you're asking about, because there were lots of things where I would feel like I had been given no information at all, but was expected to understand exactly what was going on. So, and I'm not talking about like, I was like 15 years old trying to learn how to drive, and my dad was like, put your foot on the clutch. That happened also. And me being like, what is a clutch? What is a car? I don't know. Like, you're like, but I'm talking about like being like 6 and having my dad like try to explain something like way over a 6-year-old's head, or factoring in elements of religion. A really interesting thing that happened going into like my parents both became born again Christians right after they got together. And I think as an adult, I kind of put together like, oh, I think they needed friends. I think they needed the church to provide them with a social scene. And like so they needed people who couldn't shun them for having killed babies for Uncle Sam, or, being apologists for like, the war criminal husband or whatever the fuck like the hippies were giving my parents when I was starting to be born. They needed people who were like, we just love you because you believe the same thing we do. We'll all have dinner every Wednesday and like hang out every Sunday, and that'll be your social scene. So there was a heavy religious element of just randomized, like, what's the opposite? Is it Protestant and Catholic? It was not Catholic, so it was Protestant. Is that how it goes?
You're asking a Jew, so
okay, right? Yeah.
I'm not 100% versed. I know a couple things about a couple different kinds of. Was it how? When you say born again, is that evangelical? Like, was it?
No, that's the thing. Like, it wasn't like, it was sort of just like random Christianity. Like, I couldn't tell you like, oh, we were like Methodists or Episcopalians or whatever. It was more like they devoted their life to the idea of Christianity and a faith that I think maybe had more to do with like a lifestyle, or maybe even more to do with like Bob Dylan being born again at that time. Because I when I saw the Bob Dylan movie in 2007, I was like, fuck, my mom and dad probably just like thought he was cool and did the same thing. But to give you a cool story about something that kind of like might synopsize all of this, at a certain point, my dad and I were sitting in the car, and he was like, there are some kids, and they're going to try to get you to smoke pot behind the church. And you can't do that. You have to, these kids are possessed by demons, and they're trying to get you to smoke pot. So what you need to do is say this prayer. I'll write it down for you. And then you tell them that your dad is going to like hurt them until the demons come out of them when they try to get you to smoke the pot. And I was like, oh, wow, I'm 6. I don't know what any of these fucking words mean. You're talking about demons and pot, and I'm imagining like a big cauldron, like the witches in Snow White, because I didn't know what marijuana was. I didn't know, like, there are no kids talking to me at the church. This is all just like a weird language that I'm sure my dad understood, and he wanted to express something caring and protective to me. But what happened was he scared the shit out of me, and there is not a way for me to be like, I'm scared now, I don't understand. Like, I see parents interacting with their children now, and it's great because the kids are like, what do you mean? I don't get it. I never said that when I was young. I was not allowed to say I didn't understand, because that was grounds for punishment. That was grounds for like intensity. That was grounds for like making my dad really, really angry. And that would like quiet me down immediately and then like silence me. And like, then I would just be like, okay, I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm sorry. I don't know why you're mad. I don't know what's going on, but I know I did something that made you, this towering, huge person, start to raise their voice and like get to the edge of tears, and like clearly brought up some fucking like helicopter flashback for you because I didn't know what fork to put out, or just stuff that like I feel for him now. At the time it was just scary and confusing, but now I'm like, oh man, like there was probably help that would have like benefited everybody in the family that just wasn't clear that it was out there for him.
Yeah. It was like the adult world was impinging upon your childhood without there being any kind of context. And then if you tried to figure out what the context was, you were reprimanded. And so you learned just not to, like, it's just like, here's the strangeness in my life, and I'm just going to like learn to live with it being strange.
Well, the adult world was impinged upon me. If I got it wrong, I was reprimanded as an adult would be reprimanded, not as a child would be reprimanded, which is, if I got the adult concept wrong because I was a child and I didn't understand adult concepts, I would be sort of like the equivalent of like the emotional like HR being called or something like that. It was really like, I haven't really talked about it that much until now, but it's fucking weird. It's fucking weird. And like, again, like now as I'm almost 50 years old and have kind of like gone to therapy for a long time myself and never really like mended the fences with my parents, but have had moments where I like felt sort of like a similar sort of like subconscious understanding between us both. It doesn't hurt me in the same way as it did when I was growing up, but man, it was like, I'm sure my partner would be able to tell you lots of things about like confusing things about the way that I behave, or like things that I respond to in a strange way. And they all trace back to just like being expected to know what it means when someone's saying something that they haven't really thought through completely.
Do you know what that makes me think of? It's almost like, again, terrible metaphor, but it's almost like your childhood was like an elderly person with dementia. Do you know, like, when, I don't know if you've had any family members who have like Alzheimer's or anything like that, but you know, they will pretend to know what you're talking about because they're they're like, I should know what this person is talking about. I can't remember. I don't even know who this person is necessarily. So I'm just going to pretend to know what they're talking about and nod along and kind of smile or whatever. And it almost has that kind of hazy character.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that for sure. And I definitely like, I leaned into my own version of sort of like self-protective illusions. You know, there's lots of time spent alone. There's lots of like imagination time. There's lots of time like kind of like investigating what my feelings were in private, because if I ever expressed an uncomfortable feeling or a sad feeling or like something like that where I wasn't doing super well, that was stressful to my family as well, my parents, especially when my sister came along and we were just like siblings who despised each other. And like, I didn't realize till so many years later, like, oh, you're kind of supposed to like just fight with your siblings and that's okay. But like my sister and I would like be like bratty to each other and like slapping each other around. And my parents would be like, oh my God, you're tearing each other apart. You can't be like this. I was like, nowadays I'm like, oh, do you realize how like bloodied kids make each other? Like this is fine. This is not that deep. This is actually probably really healthy to test boundaries and figure things out and try. Just, I don't know, like just my sister and I don't have the closest relationship because every time we did anything that wasn't like this sort of forced, like we are good, we are like brother and sister, we care for each other. I care for her, I love her, she's great. We didn't spend a lot of time together because like it was not ever natural time.
So is your home life then just this kind of artificial construction of what should be, what is the kind of prototypical, let's say, what we think should the American family should be?
That's interesting. I could see how you might take away that from what I'm saying, but it was so much weirder than that. Like it wasn't like my parents were like hung up on a presentation or like keeping up appearances for the church or something like that. It was more like, oh, you're just confused because you don't feel the way you want to feel, but you don't know how you want to feel. So you have no idea how to get there. I'll say a little bit more about that. Like my mom and dad, so loving, so kind, so good to us in terms of like providing for us, making sure we like understood basic tenets of like, you have to like figure out how to like treat people well. There's sort of like one of the things that's like also kind of like contradictory is like, there's a real like beautiful, there's a beautiful like inborn sort of like teaching from my family that like sort of like feminist and like anti-racist belief system that wasn't ever explicitly stated, but like sort of like it was like made an example, you know. It was sort of a thing where like we lived in rural Michigan. There were like mad racists everywhere. We were like, you know, it was the late 80s and early 90s, so it was a little bit less lawn signy, but we were always like, the friends my parents did have were not all white. They were not all middle class. They were not all anything. Like they were like, my parents were really open to, they lived in a way that showed me and my sister when we were growing up that everyone is a person of value. And I didn't really have a lot of friends that were getting that from their home life, whether that be like the gender roles in their household were sort of like mega traditional, and or like they had like an uncle who like was afraid of women and wanted to talk bad about like bitches or something, like stuff like that. Like there were times when like I would attempt things or like experiment with things when I was young, and my dad would be like, hey, no, we don't talk like that. We don't talk like that. Think about like your mom. Think about like your grandma. Like that's Would you like somebody to talk about you want somebody to call your grandma like a whore? You don't use that word. That's stupid. And it was never, that was like strangely the time when things made sense and were communicated appropriately and softly. Whereas like, if it was the type of thing where I was like, I'd like to get the Reese's peanut butter cup cereal, it'd be like, no, you can't get the Reese's cup. Like, why are you trying? Do you understand like what this means? And you're gonna like, you're like, when I started getting into music, oh my God, when I was like 16 years old and I was like, I really love playing guitar. I have a band now. We're going to go play the show in Detroit. My dad was like, you're going to waste your entire life. You're going to be on drugs in the next year. I'm not going to be here to bail you out. I don't care what you do. I don't care what you say. I'm washing my hands of this right now. You're wasting your life. And I was like, whoa, Dad. Like, I'm just excited about something. He's like, you're not going to go to school. You're going to be a bum. I'm not going to be there to pick up the pieces of your broken life because you want to go do the show. And I was like, even at 16, I was like, what's wrong with you? I don't believe you. I don't think you have thought this through well enough to be talking to me like this. And I would say that to him, and that was like, that didn't go over well either because it was already heated and already kind of like nuts. And that's one of the things I don't completely understand. So to get back to your question, it wasn't like, this has to be like a nuclear family and we're going to do good. They were just scared. They were scared that like, they probably didn't have very much money and they didn't let us know that, or they didn't communicate that to us. So they're probably scared that like they're going to pass along some intergenerational poverty. And, if like, I want to take a year off between like high school and college. Oh my God. Like the amount of like hand wringing and like weeping at the table about that was enormous and never completely explained. So it was sort of like well-intentioned, horrifically poorly executed, and never fully communicated in a way that I think you just like need to get outside of your own head to be a good communicator sometimes and think for like 20 seconds, like, how would I feel if I were the person I'm talking to?
Yeah.
And I don't think my dad ever thought it like that. I think my mom was sort of just like very much going with the flow of whatever he was doing. And just like, yeah, it was just like, it was a really confusing time that made me an extremely solitary person. And kind of like, I think that was sort of like what made music a thing for me, because as soon as I started being interested in music and bands and recording, especially like as soon as I got a 4-track, there went like all of my time that I could be spending feeling bad about myself, worrying about my relationships with my parents, my relationships with like people outside of that world. That was like a real beautiful solace. And I think it was like an extension of like Dungeons and Dragons and comic books when I was like 11, and then like, yeah, like drawing when I was 13. And then like, as soon as I got my guitar when I was 14, like to present, that's kind of where I've been. Perhaps as a shelter.
Yeah. I want to follow this thread, but first, how articulated or how aware of this fear were you? Could you say this is, it seems like there's this like strange atmosphere of unspoken fear in this household and I'm just kind of marinating in it? Or was it still this kind of strangeness that you couldn't put a finger on?
I knew it was strange. I knew it felt bad, and I knew it made me feel dread. Like I understood dread mega early on, but I didn't. But I also like the confusion was like, okay, here are the only people I really talk to. These are my protectors. The dread is coming from my mom and dad, primarily my dad. The phone call is coming from within inside the house. You know, it's like, there's like so, and there's also like a thing, like I went through a phase as a result of some of this like religious bamboozlery and like weird, like demon talk growing up. I had a phase when I was like, maybe like 12 or 13, where every night I would go to sleep, I'd lay down and my mind would start racing. And I was like, oh, I'm possessed by demons right now. Like demons are inside me. I think I like saw The Exorcist when I was really young as part of like a, religious study that my parents were like, check this out, more demons, food for thought for demons. And I would like get to a point where like every night I was like, oh, I'm like terrified and like actually would make myself sick with worry. I'd have to like knock on my parents' door and be like, I'm scared of the demons. Can I sleep on the floor? Like I spent a summer doing that when I was like probably a little bit too old. Like I wasn't 5 years old and worried about this. I was like pre-teens, and it really stressed them out. They were mad at me about it, but they cared about me. And it was a sort of thing like, oh yeah, like the kid's fucking thinks he's got demons in him again. We better they must have known on some level it was their fault that they had planted those seeds, or there must have been something going on where they're like, oh man, like this is just a phase. We had kids. We signed up for this. It's crazy stuff. But I also felt like a lot of weirdness and guilt, and like I need help. There's no one else that can help me. By asking for this help, you are going to be like angry with me. So I'm trying to like make myself invisible, even though I have this need, and I feel so completely out of control. And when I look back on it now, this is the summer that my mom and dad bought a 6-pack of Coca-Cola that I drank every day as an 11-year-old. You're not supposed to drink 6 fucking cans of Coke every day. That's why I'm up all night thinking I'm going to throw up from demons because I'm drinking. Yeah. Because I was like, oh, this tastes good. This is cool. So it's kind of like bad parenting and oblivious parenting. When I put all the pieces together, and anytime I talk to Emily about some of this stuff, like they have more of it's just like a clarity of like, oh, Fred, did you see the first 3 steps that led you to the point that you're talking about? And I was like, oh, I never thought about that way. I never realized, because I was in it. I was young. I was like in a dream world half the time that was probably like a protective coating against the real world.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's not all good. It's not all bad, right? Your parents have a moral center. They have empathy. They care.
Yeah.
And at the same exact time, inhabiting the same exact space. I was thinking about this concept earlier today, and then when I asked how you were, and you're like, well, I'm good personally in this kind of, I mean, you didn't say degraded world. I put it that, but like, it is inhabiting this kind of almost like Lynchian, and I don't mean that in a like nonsensical way of using Lynchian, but like in the same way that like in a ton of like David Lynch films, there's these 2 things inhabiting the same space, like Lost Highway or in Twin Peaks with these 2 Coopers, or like there's always this kind of like evil, we'll just call it like actual evil, that's in this same space as this like kind of morally upright existence, kind of overlapping each other. And it really feels like that kind of thing. Like that's how I feel about living in the world right now. And that's, it seems, again, I'm putting this on you. You did not use these words, but like, it seems like there is that kind of character, let's say, in your childhood.
Yeah. I think that's astute. I don't think that's projection too much. And it also kind of like plays into another thing we talked about when we first started talking. Like I'm okay with the Lynchian duality of these terrible times, because I've sort of made peace with it from the ways that my growing up felt. So I've had times where I'm like, oh man, like this does not compute. This is wrong. I don't understand. Why am I getting yelled at for not understanding? All I wanted to do was like watch TV. How did I get here?
Yeah.
And so I've got a little bit of a tortoise shell about those sorts of things, like when bizarre and bewildering things happen. Sometimes it's random, and I'm sure I exhibit some of the traits that my parents had that I really suffered from without knowing it, because that happens no matter how hard we work sometimes. But I try to be really conscious of just kind of like what would have made me feel so bad and so confused when I was young. I'm going to try my best to keep the person I'm talking to from feeling like that. I'm going to try my best to keep any of my friends from feeling that way. I'm going to try my best to not give in to the learned quality of like, well, like this is just sort of like something that like I saw exemplified for me so many times. I'm just going to kind of do like my dad did, and I'm sure it'll be fine, because I know it's not fine. And when I see other people kind of coming at me with that energy, it's like, oh yeah, I know you. It's okay. It's okay. We don't have to do it. We can both just take today off and it doesn't hurt me like it did when I was very, very small and had no power of my own.
Yeah. So then going back to music, is it something that you gravitate towards because it is something you can do on your own, or is it a way of connecting with other people outside of your family?
It is both, but it's not necessarily a respite from my family in particular. It never really was. In fact, I think I was just so driven, going back to the start of my musical times, when I look back on it with a clear head and some distance, I'm like, oh my God, I just grabbed all the neighborhood kids and made them be in my metal band. No one expressed interest. Like, I didn't have conversations where I was like, man, I love Megadeth. You like them too? Would you ever want to be in a band? I was just like, I love Megadeth. You're the drummer. And then the kids would be like, I don't play drums. What are you talking about? I'm like, you do now. Like, you're in my band. We're called the Dead Cop Babies or some shit like that. Like, I was like 13 years old, and like, I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And there's been a little bit of that moving forward through the years. Every time I start a project, I try to let go of a little bit of the control and kind of let things, yeah, I'm part of this thing, but like, I always am a little bit more excited about it than my collaborators, and it kind of goes back to
I get that.
Yeah, maybe I just needed that space so badly because, you know, apart from just like the parental issues that I had sometimes, like, growing up is terrible. Growing up is it would have been confusing if my parents had like explained everything to me with a PowerPoint presentation and I got it completely. I still had a really hard time connecting with other kids. I still had a really hard time making a dividing line between imagination world and the real world. I had a really hard time. Yeah. Talking to adults in a way that like didn't make them extremely angry, and just knowing social boundaries was hard for me. Yeah. It was heavy. Growing up sucked.
Even adults outside of your parents?
Yeah. So maybe like I took some of the household thing, or maybe it was just me. Maybe like my personality was sort of just one of confusion, and one where like I had no problem like talking to people at like the grocery store or at, you know, the bus stop. And I'd say like one time out of 10, I would have like a really angry, visceral reaction from some adult who was like irritated or confused by this little kid being in their space, or maybe I misread what the societal norms were. It's hard for me to really remember it too, because it's so long ago, but I do have a couple things that come to mind where I'm like, whoa, I really got yelled at really severely by a stranger in a way that you're not supposed to yell at somebody else's kid. What did I do that put them off the edge? Or were they like having a really bad day? Was there some undiagnosed mental illness that like made it okay for them? Did they just fucking hate little bratty kids like being around? How'd that happen? Like weird memories that are cloudy to me now, but play into a really kind of like less than fun childhood.
Yeah. I'm going to say this. Unless, and you know what, actually, I'm just going to, no qualifications. If you're an adult and a kid is talking to you, there's no matter what that kid is saying, as an adult, you should have your shit together to not yell at them. I'm going to put that fully on these 1 out of 10, these 10% in your life.
10%ers. Maybe it was like rural Michigan. Maybe like I was just like in like maybe I was in the zone. Maybe there's things I always think back on where I'm like, oh, you know, like whenever I'm at a gig and someone's weird to me, I'm like, man, they're being weird. What the fuck? Oh, right. People are high all the time. People are like fucking on drugs that I don't even think about. It's possible that like the neighbor that was like kind of strange, or like the elderly person at the thrift store who like yelled at me and my mom, was like on some meth or on some like an early adopter for crack. I have no idea. It's like Michigan in the 90s. We have no receipts for it, but I agree with you. They should not be yelling at kids.
Yeah. Well, there's this thing. I tend to assume everyone is not on something when I'm
Same.
talking to them. That's my assumption because I'm a teetotaler and I've never even smoked pot. It's just never interested me. That's really it. There's nothing, I don't have anything against it. If you want to, there's, people that hang out and do meth in my neighborhood. And I'm just kind of like, all right, just clean up after yourself.
Sure.
Just don't smash a pipe on the ground so that I have to now worry about my dog getting, pipe shards in her paw or whatever. Right. That's it. I guess that's my only real. So my assumption is always that. And then as I become an adult, as if I'm not in my middle age at this point, but like as I learn more about the world, I'm like, oh, there's plenty of people. I mean, especially in Los Angeles, who are fucking high all the time. Or there's just people you encounter that are just like, whatever. Maybe they're supposed to be on meds and they're not on their meds, or whatever. They're on the wrong thing. Or there's so many things that can change people's brain chemistry that my assumptions that everyone else is coming at me in a sober way it's a terrible assumption. It's the assumption of a child, basically.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a privileged assumption, but it is sort of like just, this is a perspective that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds, that you never know what somebody else has going on. It's an impossible lesson to retain, but it's such a mandatory thing. And when I remember to fall back on that, just very simple, like, like you never know what else somebody has going on. It takes a lot of the teeth out of most of my painful interactions. Because it's a lot less about me, and it's less about like, what did I do, or how could that person be so terrible, or like, what is like. I have friends who are so smart that they're almost always like, this person said this complimentary thing about my song, which means that they feel the opposite about everything they didn't say. And do you think that because they said this? And I'm just like, oh man, like they probably just think you're cute. You know what I mean? They're probably like, oh, look at that handsome man playing the guitar. Like, wow, I should probably say something to him to have an excuse to talk to him. That's you don't know, and it doesn't matter. And the more you think about it, the less the further away you get from what is actually happening.
Yeah. But I'm so full of resentment that it's tough for me to do that. In fact, but it's so, I mean, I just have these blinders on because my wife will say something and I'll be like, well, you can't assume that. So I can obviously see this in other people. I can obviously see when other people are making assumptions about things. But in my own heart, it's all just dark. It's all just black ichor. It's just dark gunk.
Yeah. What's the wildest thing though? I mean, like we know this, and we have learned these things about ourselves, and we have these lessons that are so slippery that I still spend so much of my days kind of being like, oh, I know this already. I know. I mean, most of the things we're talking about, like I've processed, I've paid people to help me talk about. I have like tried pills to help me understand and like deal with. I have broken up friendships over that really I had no business either being friends with that person in the first place or taking it out on the friendship. There's like stuff that like it all kind of gets rendered answerless in how we go over it over and over and over again, and somehow still sort of like are in the hamster wheel of like, oh, I know that I know what's going on as best I can, as best as I think I can now. I'm just going to be fucking mad about it. I'm still going to just like, or I'm just going to feel hurt. I'm just going to, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. So that's the weird thing for me. Like, why does it get easier? Do the lessons get less slippery? Do the interactions get less bristly? Is there a moment when the mean senior citizen yelling at me for like, knocking over the thing in the convenience store is not in my brain at 5 a.m.
Yep.
I wake up and I'm like, oh, I know the name of the professor that scolded me in front of the entire class for trying to give him my zine when I was in community college. He's probably dead. that was 30 years ago and he was already 60. If he's still alive, what do I do? Do I call him? Do I look him up on fucking Facebook? Like, this hurts me to even say out loud. I feel so stupid talking about it, but it's there.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So what do we do? How do we get away?
I think the thing, when you were saying this, the thing that I think about this, the slipperiness of these lessons, it makes me think of, there's this philosopher, I forget his first name. His last name's Fichte. So he's in this middle period between Kant and Hegel. And I don't remember much about him, but I do remember one term that he came up with is striving. And the whole point, he says, is it's strive. You'll never get there. Whatever the thing is that you're trying to, whatever these lessons that are so slippery, you will never, ever hold them in your hand. They will never, not like a fish, like kind of floating out of your hands, right? They're always going to do that. But the point is to keep striving, to hold the fish longer and longer. That's not his metaphor, by the way. This is my own shitty metaphor. But
you just got to hold the fish a little bit longer.
So, okay, we're at the end. And the thing that I've been fascinated with lately, the past couple of years, is the line between you being someone who appreciates art or music and someone who wants to make their own. And I'm curious about what happened for you to phase shift into that second, in that second mode of being.
This is a fantastic question for right now in October of 2024, because we're talking today because I just put out a new record, and it's the first record maybe ever in about 30 years of making music where I actually let it be thoroughly 100% whatever it was going to be from within myself. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Like, I am definitely like a music fan and an admirer of ideas first, in a way that's slightly parasitic, in a way that's like, oh my God, I love this television personality song. I can't believe that got made. I wish it were enough for me to listen to it and play it for my friends and like go on long walks with it, but nope, I gotta try to make it again myself. I gotta try to like I wish it was enough for me to just be like, wow, I love Alice Coltrane so much. I'm not gonna buy a harp and try to learn Alice Coltrane's like, you know, Afro spiritual harp world, but how could I do my own thing where I allow my own experience to like be seen through the lens of my love for Alice Coltrane? That's my whole oeuvre up until now. Because that line is blurry, the line for me between like, oh man, like that's beautiful, I appreciate that inspires me to do something, and like, and I want to co-opt that. I have a weird line with that. My old band Saturday Looks Good to Me. It was so like my friend made a tape where he sort of like copied the Beach Boys and Motown on his 4-track. And I was like, wow, Chris, Teach Me Tiger. This is perfect. I'm going to do that too, exactly like you did it. So it was a copy of it. It was Simulacrum times 3. It was like, yeah, right. And that was like, and I was rewarded greatly for copying Chris's idea of copying Motown and the Beach Boys. And whatever, my songs are good. I'm a good songwriter. Those records are good. I'm not discounting them as mere ripoffs of ripoffs, but the impetus was for me to see what I loved in somebody else's thing and just sort of make it in my own image. And it took me a long time to let go of that fearful attachment and just kind of be like, this last record, I was alone. I was alone for a couple of weeks when Emily was out of the house visiting someone, and I got bored and I was like, oh, I'm just going to like sit down and play, see what happens. And usually what happens is like, ooh, that reminds me of like Guided by Voices. That reminds me of like something else. That reminds me of something I've heard somewhere along the line. Let me see if I can sort of like mold this into something cool that I know is cool because someone else has already validated that it's cool by making it. And instead of doing that, I was like, you know what? I don't know if I like this. Let's just keep going with it. Or let me just kind of like step away and like not watch this pot of water boil. And what happened was the the record that just came out. It's really weird. I don't feel super connected to it because I didn't micromanage it, and I didn't put any of the stress of like, oh, this person, like this imaginary person in my mind won't think it's cool because like it has no reference point. There's no like secret handshake that it sort of sounds like Klooster or you know, whatever, something else. It was just sort of like, yeah, like this is what happened during these 2 weeks when I was making these long songs, and they're good. And I'm sure you could say that there's like little bits of inspiration here and there, but like I didn't actually think about that in the way I normally do. I wasn't going for that in the way I always have before.
It's interesting because I think I'm a good songwriter, but I don't do it often enough to be like to be to anymore to do what you were just saying. But I have that idea. I have that feeling with scripts because I've been writing for so long now, where it used to be, well, I want to do my version of X, Y, or Z, and now
Sure.
it's just kind of like, well, I have this idea. I'm just going to write it, and we'll see what happens. And then I'm just going to follow the natural story that feels like it flows out of what these characters are doing, as opposed to imposing something on them that I think should be because I think it's going to sell or whatever, right? So it should have...
Or the homage feels safe, or like you know that the thing that you're inspired by is inspiring because that concept has been proven. So maybe someone who doesn't know about that will be like, oh, like this is a great idea.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. But so, songwriting, it's always been this thing where I'm just like, well, I'm going to try to do my version of Steve Malkmus, or I'm going to try to do Dave Berman. And I have at points and pieces been able to let that stuff go and just let something flow. What changed in you, though, that allowed this to happen now?
That's an amazing question. I have no idea. I wish I knew what it was. And I think maybe it goes back to the very beginning of our talk. It might just be fatigue. It might just be the thing. It might just be a thing where like I have been at various stages of this, making music independently since I was 14 or 15, going back to the gig in Detroit that my dad got mad about when I was 15 years old, going back to like signing with Polyvinyl when I was like 22 years old, 24 years old, something like that. And then like quite recently, a couple like weird little like milestone type things happened that I never would have expected ever, and I wouldn't have dreamed of because there wasn't a way to dream about them when I was growing up. You know, like my band had our first like 1 million streams on Spotify, and that's not a big deal for most bands, but like my streaming numbers are pretty low. So to have like that little milestone, I was like, whoa, that's really incredible. Like I never would have expected that. I don't know if it feels like, I don't know if I can even relate to that feeling, you know? And much as I talked about, like, I went on tour with this band I was excited about and they were dicks to me. In the last 2 years, I started playing in a band where Steve Shelley from Sonic Youth is the drummer. And he's the nicest guy. He's super fun to tour with. Like, he just, like, wants to play me, like, kind of obscure country songs and have a good time. And he's an amazing drummer. And he played on some of my most foundational, like some of the most foundational music ever. He's the drummer for.
Yeah, for sure.
And now we text about like dumb movies and shit. And so these are things where I'm like, whoa, like this is like my own sort of like small, humble version of like what I've always wanted. It has been achieved. I don't necessarily need to like push or impress an imaginary audience. I don't necessarily need to do anything that isn't coming out of me naturally. And I never understand what that's for because there's so many more steps in front of me. So letting it happen with no expectation. Honestly, like when I brought this record to Polyvinyl, it's a double LP. It's an hour long. There's 7 songs. I was like, I will understand if you do not want to put this record out. It will lose money. It will cost a lot of money to like put up front. Like I get it. I was just going to put it on Bandcamp because it's really good. And they're like, no, this is really, really good. We believe in you. We'll figure out a way to make this happen because they have no unrealistic expectations either. They're not like, are we going to try to like get on festivals? Are we going to try to like, are you going to go like, no, I'm like, I have had my time of touring 10 months of the year. It was fine. It sucked. It was the best. It was all the things. I don't need to necessarily revisit that. And there's a weightlessness in that freedom that has made a lot more space for creativity to come through.
I love that. Okay, then final thing though. What was the thing that phase shifted you though from music appreciator even to this early I'm going to do my version of like Dave Mustaine, whatever, right? What was the thing?
That
launched you?
That's a great question. Wow. The very, very beginning, earliest thing, I don't know, man. Like for me, it was never a question. Like for me, it was definitely a thing where like before I knew what chords were on the guitar, before it was like, oh yes, G major, campfire chords. I knew the guitar was in my house and I was writing songs and recording them on it and making little tapes and like giving them to people at school. Before I knew how to really like do anything. And I would get feedback. I would get the same feedback at age 13 that I get now, where people are like, you're not really that good of a singer. Maybe you should get somebody else to sing. And I was like, no, this is it. This is what it is. You're wrong. You're going to love this. Take it. And so maybe there wasn't a phase shift. Maybe it was a type of thing where I didn't get the memo that not everybody is Mick Jagger. Maybe I just thought everybody was supposed to be that. Or maybe I just felt like such a burning need to make this music and care about it and like it, even if I didn't necessarily know if I liked it. It was just like, this was my art, this was my music, this is what I got.
I mean, when you were that young, did it help you articulate things that you couldn't talk about? I mean, that's I say this a lot on this show. It's just like bullshit armchair Freudian stuff, but there might be some measure of truth there, particle of truth.
Maybe, but you know what? With that question in mind, with that like kind of like psychological vantage point, I think more than anything, it offered me an identity, even if I didn't thoroughly believe in that identity, especially when I was in my 20s and like doing the thing.
Yeah, that's it. I think you hit upon it. I think that is such a real feeling of like, okay, this is giving me, this is, you know, even if it's not articulating something that you can't really define, it is giving some kind of boundary in your life. And in like lots of people's, including mine. Well, you saying that made me think of like how much music gave me a kind of cell wall to the mushy insides of my existence.
And it's I'll share one last anecdote because I know it's probably you're gonna have to edit this a lot now that we talk so much, but we just took photos for this record, and my friend Kerrigan, who Detroit photographer, awesome lady, she's 27, I'm 48, and I sent her some like Polaroids I wanted to use. The idea is like, we're gonna have some Polaroids that like I hold up to like from like when I was younger, and then like Polaroid from today, and we kind of like same person but different, but like obscured, and it kind of, that's what the record's about. And all the Polaroids I sent her, she's like, oh wow, indie sleaze, love it. And I was like, oh no, it wasn't indie sleaze. I wasn't part of that. But like for someone who, you know, was like 6 years old when the Strokes came out, like yeah, they didn't know that like, oh, everybody kind of was doing this thing and it was a little bit different, and like we were all so insecure, and I had been like in an emo band like a couple weeks before I went over to like garage rock, and it was just all sort of this like very like, I hope I'm doing the right thing. I just really hope the person I have a crush on feels the same way. That's all it was about, really. And even like the songs themselves, I think back to some of the songs that I made when I was wildly insecure, and they're pretty bad. There's nothing going on in those lyrics. It's not like it didn't help me articulate shit. If anything, it got further and further away from actual feelings and articulation. Yeah. But it was the vehicle by which I I felt just like a little bit less bad about myself in those years.
Goddamn, Fred, I could talk to you for hours. This was
Likewise.
Yeah, thanks. But the new album is fantastic, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot.
It's just so good.
Fuck yeah. I'm glad you liked it. And hopefully this talk maybe like gives you a deeper insight into like how messed up I actually am and how those songs reflect that.
All right, Fred. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye.